Clean Student Movement and Global Action. Yeah, nice to see you all. Of practical things, we have Larry Lohmann with us today. He will have a presentation for maybe about 40 minutes, and there will be time for some questions in the end. I think maybe if we will still be this amount of people, people can choose themselves to write either a star in the chat and say the question themselves, or they can just write their questions directly in the chat. And then we'll see how many questions Larry will have time for in the end. And yeah, we are recording the webinar. It should say that on the slide as well, but if you're uncomfortable with that, you can write to Birgitte in the chat and she will let you know how to be anonymous in the webinar. So who are we? We are a group of activists from Global Action. During the spring, we were supposed to do a lot of events on how climate action or efficient, effective climate action is hindered by our current trade system and how it's almost impossible to talk about real climate action without also addressing the way we trade and the rules under which we trade. And Global Action, that's a solidarity organization that works together with a lot of different grassroots movements around the world, up till now mainly in Africa, but we are starting to have some partnerships in some other countries as well. And we also work with the more, should I say, structural causes of global inequality. So we work with, for example, food sovereignty, workers' rights, fishers' rights, a lot of different things together with social movements around the world. And yeah, we'll see how long we will continue with this events, but there will at least be a new one on Tuesday with Cecilia Olivet from Transnational Institute about a treaty that is not very known, but it's called Energy Charter Treaty. And if you follow us on Facebook, you can find the event and read more about it. I think it will be really interesting. And Larry, who is with us today, he is a researcher and activist at the Corner House based in the UK, but right now you're in Ecuador. And he has worked for many years with the topics of social justice, climate change, and he's also an expert of carbon trading. So I think you can probably present yourself better than I can. Before I give the word to you, I just want to say one last thing, and that is that we will, if this Corona situation is changing, in the fall, we will host an activist school for people interested in climate activism, where Larry will also participate. So you can find more information about that also on our Facebook. So then I think I will just give the word to you, Larry, and welcome.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, let me try to launch my screen here. I was telling the others my presentation is not exactly what I'm supposed to be talking about, which is carbon trading, which I've been talking about for many years with lots of colleagues. But I'm going to try to take a little step back and look at some of the foundations of carbon trading and some of the things that are really deeply behind carbon trading. So the title of my talk, can everybody see it? Is it okay? The title of my talk is that carbon policy is not climate policy, toward a different agenda for climate activism. What I'm going to try to suggest is that movements need to move farther away from thinking about climate change in terms of carbon. It is more effective to think about it in terms of work. This is hard because the idea that climate is about carbon is embedded in climate thinking on both the right and the left. In fact, they're almost synonymous these days. You know, everybody thinks that climate change is about carbon emissions, too many carbon emissions, and we have to reduce carbon emissions. And it's assumed, it just almost goes without saying. And I want to take a step back and question it a little bit, not only from my perspective, but from the perspective of a lot of people that I work with, especially in the global South, and often in rural areas or slum areas, who have a very different perspective on climate change. So I'm going to try to step outside the mainstream discourse and look at it a little bit critically. What do I mean by carbon policies? When I say carbon policies are not climate policies, some examples are the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, which is all about carbon. The Paris Agreement is all about carbon emissions, and other carbon market schemes. I mean, the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement are basically carbon market schemes, but there are many others in addition to these. There's the EU emissions trading scheme, there's schemes in China, there's schemes in California, there's schemes in many other countries, several dozen schemes, all in all. Carbon tax schemes is another carbon policy, which says that it's climate policy. And people often oppose carbon tax schemes and carbon market schemes and say, oh, these are opposites. But from the perspective I'm taking, I'm going to look at them as from outside, as things which actually have a lot in common. Those energy transition plans. These often don't mention carbon in the title of the plans, but underlying them is usually the idea is that a transition is a transition not to a different way of living, not to a different way of organizing trade or society, but to fewer carbon emissions. And that's almost assumed, almost understood in most energy transition plans. Geoengineering is another thing that's focused on reducing carbon emissions or the effects of carbon emissions. And Green New Deals also implicitly are all about carbon. Now, if you're like me, I mean, you think all of these things are very different, and they are very different. I mean, for example, as an activist, I'm very willing and very eager to talk to people who are interested in Green New Deals and who have proposals for Green New Deals. But I'm not so interested in spending time with people who are enthusiastic about geoengineering. These schemes of putting mirrors in space or putting particles in the atmosphere or pumping carbon underground, re-engineering the planet. I'm not so interested in talking to those people, but I am interested in talking to Green New Deal enthusiasts. I feel I have more in common with them. So these things are all different, but my topic today is not going to be talking about the differences, but talking about the similarities in that they're all carbon policies. As I say, we're used to making fine distinctions among all of these policies, but they all have one thing in common. They all start from the CO2 molecule, which is my focus today. They explain climate change by the CO2 molecule. They say the problem with climate, the cause of climate change is there's too many CO2 molecules in the atmosphere. And of course, here CO2 can be a shorthand for other greenhouse gases as well. And usually the way of addressing climate change, Kyoto, Paris, whatever, is to get managers to predict and control movements of CO2 molecules and their effects. Stop those CO2 molecules from moving into the atmosphere and the climate problem will be solved, is the underlying assumption. For example, carbon market schemes such as the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement put their faith in the power of the state to limit and put a correct price on the movements of CO2 molecules with the help of markets, carbon markets, of course. Carbon tax schemes also seek to address climate change by getting the state to put a price on CO2 molecule movements. Energy transition plans usually accept capitalism's energy regime, but they assume that the amount of carbon that it moves to the atmosphere can be reduced by the state or by the market. Geoengineering also leaves capital's energy regime alone and puts its faith in state prediction and control of the movements of CO2 molecules or the effects of those movements. And Green New Deals also usually accept the idea of a decarbonized capitalistic energy system, but suggest that the state push things along and add a few extras to try to cut the damage to the working classes. Some parts of the working classes, that is. I thought I should put in an interesting critical comment, which was made recently by Nick Estes, who's an indigenous North American historian, who says, I feel a little bit strange about these Green New Deals because I'm worried that it's going to, again, sacrifice indigenous lands. In our territory, for example, in the Navajo territory in the southwestern United States, I mean, they're used to having a lot of coal mining, coal-fired power plants, uranium mining, and all of the pollution that entails and the devastation that entails. And he asks the question, well, what's the difference here if they're going to take over our land and put all these solar powered plants out? And I mean, it sounds like the same kind of thing to me. So I think that's a very legitimate question to ask about Green New Deals. So I just thought I would add that in. Anyway, so far I've been talking about the image of the state expert predicting and controlling molecule movements through price or other means, carbon taxes, carbon trading, or whatnot. But of course, it's not just the CO2 molecule. I'm talking about the CO2 molecule as a sort of symbol, but it's not an isolated image. The CO2 molecule comes complete with an image of universal Cartesian space, which we're all familiar with. It comes familiar with this idea of dead physical things that can be bracketed, predicted, and controlled. This is a famous painting from the English painting from the 18th century, where it just shows different people's reactions to the scientific experiments in prediction and control that were being undertaken at the time. At the top, there's a bird trapped in a glass jar from which the air is being removed. They're predicting the bird will die, and they're controlling the air in the little glass sphere, so that they can moderate the amount of air molecules in there, and they see what happens to the bird, and then different people in the room have different kinds of reactions to what's going on. I think the name of the painter was Joseph Smith, I think. Anyway, and ultimately, of the purely physical climate system described in general circulation models, these supercomputer-powered models that have been dominant in creating our image of climate for the last several decades, really the post-war period. This picture of climate change as a matter of molecular movements in a physical system was built up bit by bit, unintentionally. Over the years, it became more and more institutionalized via, for example, cybernetic theory, post-war cybernetic theory, ecosystems theory as well, and the military-centered post-war development of digital computing, which, of course, at the heart of our image of climate are these models that can only be created inside supercomputers. So there's more and more apparatuses for prediction and control of an external entity modeled inside computers. But there's less and less capacity to interact with the living climate, anticipate, analyze history, and make rational decisions. This is Marcus Taylor, who's a professor in Canada, and he's a very, very interesting analysis where he shows how climate change became seen as an outside forcing to an otherwise coherent model of atmospheric dynamics. And that word forcing, I think, is very revealing. Whenever you read scientific studies on climate change, they always talk about forcing. Somebody is forcing the climate into an unnatural or an unfortunate position. The carbon dioxide molecules are forcing the climate into some strange configuration. And of course, the corollary to this is that climate action becomes seen as a reverse forcing. Okay, we got to stop this forcing. We got to reverse this forcing. This is known as mitigation, changes in this physical climate system. And who is doing this forcing? Well, of course, the carbon dioxide molecules, but it's really behind that is this society, this abstract, generalized society that climatologists talk about. And of course, what this means is capitalist society, because they never say it, but it's assumed that society must be a capitalist society. So you get this picture of these two separate systems, this purely physical system on the right, this sort of a computer modeled, controllable, predictable system on the right. And then you have this abstract system on the left, which is basically capitalism in disguise. Forcing that system, and the system, the system goes into a bad situation, and then you adapt to it, or you try to change the system back. Anyway, there's a very dualistic kind of thing. It's a dance between these two sort of entities which have been created by this image, this physical system and then this abstract social system, and they're in a sort of dance together. And of course, this picture, although it seems very familiar and natural to us, fits beautifully with capitalist and neoliberal ideology. But, and this is something I really need to emphasize, it contrasts sharply with the global majority's understanding of climate change. When you go and talk to people in many different places in the world, whether it's, Molo in Indonesia, or the central Los Angeles, or the Andes, you talk to people about climate change and what they've seen and what they think about it, you get a very different picture from this picture, this dualistic picture of the physical computer modeled predictable climate system and society on the other side. A lot of people, they use a different vocabulary when they talk about climate. They say, we're doing something wrong. Something has to change. They're talking about, society and the climate together. This sounds very critical, but this is not at all to disparage climatology, which I rely on and which has shown us so much, but only to notice what kind of relationships this picture tends to reinforce. And I have a quick analogy here with Google Translate, which might seem something completely different, but is not actually so different. I love Google Translate. I use it all the time, but you have to understand what kind of relationships it encourages and what it doesn't encourage. Google Translate doesn't interact with people the way that a living human translator interacts with people. Instead, it uses algorithms, fast processors, and large amounts of energy to predict what a good human translator would do based on masses and masses of digitized evidence about sentences from the past. So there's no interaction with humans here, and there's only use of past masses of evidence. So there's no development like you see when a translator is actually actively involved in trying to socialize with groups of people from different backgrounds. These general circulation models treat climate in much the same way as a physical entity whose behavior is to be more or less statistically predicted on the basis of past evidence, not as a living creative being oriented toward an emerging future, and whose actions are constituted partly by surplus accumulation involving fatigue or maxing out of various kinds of living work of nature, including that of prehistoric carboniferous organisms, which is, of course, what we all rely on, is the unpaid work of a lot of plants and sea animals and so forth in the past that have given their work to create fossil fuels. For example, none of these things, plantation system, the factory system, the system of mining coal, the factories, the polluting factory system, none of these things are part of climate change on a climatological view. Nothing to do with this. We don't need to study this. This is not climate. It seems obvious to us. It seems common sense. What does this have to do with climate? Climate is about carbon dioxide. But I think we need to back up and we need to call attention to the strangeness of this fact that none of these things are seen to have anything to do with climate. When you talk to the United Nations, when you talk to European governments, oh no, nothing to do with climate change. So without disrespecting the achievements of climatology and climate policy, I think we can see two irrational outcomes of this mainstream stance. One of them is molecule fetishism. I'll try to explain that a bit later. And the second thing, which is very much connected with that, is that there is no analysis of the role of fossil-fueled machines in the exploitation of living capitalist labor, and thus an inability to anticipate as opposed to predict the course of climate change. So let's talk a little bit about molecule fetishism. When we talk about molecule fetishism, this fixation on CO2 molecules, we're talking about fantasy, the way fantasy structures reality inside climate science and inside climate policy. So let's go back to that picture of an organic, ideally predictable climate modeled inside computer programs and sort of endlessly cycling, endlessly developing inside the computer. And when we look at this picture, let's try to remember Slavoj Žižek's point that society as a corporate body, an organically functioning whole with all the different classes, genders, etc., is always the fundamental ideological fantasy. For example, the Nazi fantasy of an organic, harmonious Aryan society couldn't have worked without the fantasy figure of the alien Jew coming in and spoiling everything from outside. If it wasn't for the Jew, everything would be fine in Nazi fantasy. Similarly, the 20th century fantasy of a unique, exceptional, harmonious, non-racist Thai society, which I think began to develop around 1910 or 1920, paradoxically needed the racist fantasy of the disharmonious non-Thai who was there either inside Thai society or outside the country's borders. And today's Trumpian fantasy of making America great again, of course, requires the fantasy of the dangerous immigrant, which might be human, might be non-human, might be both. So too, the fantasy of a computer modelable climate system is incomplete without the fantasy that what forces the normal atmospheric system is CO2 molecules coming in from outside it. There's that word forcing again. The fantasy logic is always to organize reality so that the solution to contradictions and conflicts becomes the exclusion of the disruptive other. This other might be human, which is the key example of this is the immigrants, which are such a dominant fantasy among all of the new right-wing governments around the world. Or it could be other than human. Coronavirus is an interesting example. But in order to be powerful enough to explain away the deep ecological and political contradictions and conflicts, these others must always be endowed with a special magic, a mystical aura, superhuman charge, je ne sais quoi, an indescribable oomph, zip or surplus, a sinister victorious secret. And one of the things that makes these fantasy figures so difficult to talk about in rational terms is that you can talk in rational terms, in factual terms about the Jew for as long as you want to, but that's not going to affect the fantasy of people who need that figure in order to explain society's contradictions. It's not a rational construction. It's a construction with a special magic. These things have special magic. The coronavirus, I think, in some ways is developing into that. And the CO2 molecule I want to suggest also is not the CO2 molecule that you would necessarily study in a chemistry textbook. It's a CO2 molecule that has a special magic, a special disruptive power, a special, je ne sais quoi. Which is why we have to have equally magic or mystical, beautiful walls to keep them out. I mean, when you try to talk to Trump about his wall, his beautiful wall in rational terms, you're not getting anywhere. You can't talk to Trump in rational terms about the wall because the wall is magic too. The wall has to be magic in order to keep out those powerful and magic immigrants that are coming to destroy our perfect society. Climate laws that are based on carbon based on excluding excess alien carbon are magic in the same way. You can't talk to the UN in rational terms about these things not working. Everybody knows they don't work, but that's not the point. They're powerful fantasies which appeal to people because they help explain, you know, what the threat is to our society in terms that put the threat outside in these carbon dioxide molecules. Thus, the Paris Agreement or your typical energy transition plan has no problem with carbon extraction as such, no problem with coal mining necessarily, no problem with oil, but it does have a problem with carbon after it becomes an immigrant, when it starts moving around in CO2 form and crosses the border into that beautiful atmosphere that we have to protect. So what do you do when the carbon dioxide immigrants arrive in your beautiful territory? Well, maybe you arrest the carbon and you sequester it in trees. Sequester, that's another word I want to emphasize a little bit. Sequester means, you know, kidnapping somebody or arresting somebody or putting somebody in prison. And it's interesting that all of the scientific talk about carbon trading and carbon offsets talk about how are we going to sequester this carbon? How are we going to detain it? How are we going to arrest it, imprison it, so that it doesn't harm our perfect atmosphere? Or maybe you bury it underground, which is the carbon capture and sequestration, one of these geoengineering schemes. Or maybe you rehabilitate the carbon by showing that, okay, yeah, we have these immigrants inside our territory, our atmospheric territory, but just think, if we didn't have carbon trading or if we didn't have carbon taxes, there would be many more immigrants in our territory, and then we'd have an even bigger problem. This is the so-called rationale behind carbon offsets. Similarly, you can declare beautiful wars on various aliens to make everything all right. And I think we're all beginning to have experience of this with the coronavirus crisis and the official state reactions to coronavirus. But of course, the fact that these wars are fantasies doesn't mean that they don't kill people. They do. Just like the wall is a real fantasy made out of steel and concrete. You might talk about the wars on COVID-19 that are now being questioned by movements like the Zapatista movements, who are calling attention to the militaristic aspects of the reaction to the COVID virus, or the reaction of people whose land is taken away to provide prisons for those carbon molecules that are immigrating into our atmosphere and threatening all of us. And of course, you see these movements all around the world fighting against the effects of carbon trading, because carbon offsets, land-based carbon offsets, require that people's land and forests be taken away from them to serve as prisons for carbon dioxide molecules to keep them out of our atmosphere. The problem, I think, is for us European types is we often have a hard time accepting that contemporary mainstream science and policy are loaded with fetishes and fantasy in this way. We can easily see the racism fantasies and anti-science blustering in Donald Trump or Jair Bolsonaro. But we often assume that the antidote to their racist anti-science postures must be more science and policy advice. We don't realize the structural similarities of the fetishes that are inside not only Trump, but also inside climate science itself. Let me give an example by moving from Trump to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the official group of scientists advising the UN climate apparatus. In 2014, Sir John Houghton, a founding member of the IPCC and its chair for a long time, gave an interview explaining why IPCC scientists could not mention the carbon in fossil fuels in their analysis of climate change, but they could mention carbon that had become an immigrant, carbon that had become more mobile in the form of CO2. He explained it in seemingly very reasonable terms, which are reasonable only until you examine them closely. He said, to follow what happens when carbon atoms move over the border into the atmosphere is science, Houghton said. But to analyze what happens to make so many carbon atoms migrate in this way is not a science question. In other words, you can look at the carbon when it becomes carbon dioxide, that's science. But you can't look at the carbon when it's still inside fossil fuels or natural gas or oil, because that's not science somehow. Interesting. In other words, fossil fuel extractivism can have nothing to do with the climate object defined by climatology, and that's official. So it's not just that IPC scientists fear capitalist reaction when they refuse to talk about fossil fuels and capitalism. It's also that the structure and the institutions of their science itself are defined deeply by the same fantasies about disruptive immigrants that can be found in the racism of a Trump or a Bolsonaro. For activists, at least activists like me, the political problem of such fantasies is that they persist whether or not they work. Everybody knows that carbon trading doesn't work. Everybody knows that carbon taxes don't work. Everybody knows that the Paris Agreement can't work. I'm not going to go into the details here, but I mean, all you need to do is to look at a few graphs of the way carbon emissions go up, graphs of the prices of carbon molecules in carbon markets or carbon taxes, the way they fluctuate, the way they are dependent on all sorts of factors which ensure that they will have no effect on climate change. All you need to do is look at the history of the last 20 years of carbon markets. And these things are not only do they have no effect on climate or actually damaging climate stability, they actually don't even have any effect on that fantasy of immigration. They don't have any effect on the immigration of carbon dioxide molecules. There's still carbon dioxide molecules building up in the atmosphere. The problem is that knowing that the underlying contradictions are ignored in carbon policy has made little difference to mainstream climate politics for over 25 years. And again, this goes back to the point that you can't undo the magic powers of these fantasy figures, like the Paris Agreement, like the Jew, like the carbon dioxide molecule, like the wall, the irrational argument, any more than you can undo the magic powers of any ordinary everyday fetish by refusing to believe in it or explaining the way things really are. In this connection, it's interesting to note the reactions to the familiar phenomenon of pollution reductions during crises, like the 2008 financial crisis or like the current COVID crisis. For example, you've probably all seen these pictures of how dramatically the nitrogen dioxide reductions in Europe and in China during a COVID-19 crisis. And these reductions are remarkable because they're much greater than any reductions that have ever been achieved or ever could be achieved due to climate policy, mainstream climate policy. And this is due mainly to the idling of machines used to exploit and discipline labor, whether production, circulation, or consumption labor. And of course, you've seen this during many previous crises already. And this graph shows some of those older crises. And I think what's interesting to me is that people seem to see two things in these pictures. First, everybody knows that, as in these graphs, as soon as the crisis is supposedly over, the increases in pollution will continue. In fact, with the COVID crisis, as with other crises, probably what will happen next year is that all of the environmental regulations will be relaxed, and people will say we have to recover the economy, so let's forget about these pollution regulations. Let's forget about energy efficiency for a while, and let's just recover our economy by increasing our emissions until we get better. And then after that, we can maybe talk about the environment a little bit or about climate change. So things will probably get worse, after the crisis passes. People, I think, understand that. But second, they also understand that it's really quite remarkable that these crises achieve more for climate than any climate policy, any carbon policy in history. And therefore, maybe we should examine them more closely to see what a more effective climate policy would look like. And I think that's another factor that might encourage us to have more subject-changing conversations that help traverse the fantasies inside climatology and carbon policy and move closer toward a really effective climate politics instead. And again, I think, as I suggested, through the whole talk, is that that means engaging in conversations with maybe a different and wider groups of people, broader movements about these issues of machines, these issues of labor, these issues of colonialism, these issues of empire, and issues of capital itself, which are the real issues that need to be discussed if we're going to get away from these carbon policies toward a more effective movement building around climate. The end. Good, I can see I'm
Thank you so
more or
much,
less on
Larry,
time.
for a very interesting presentation. I see that there's already one question in the chat. And if other people have questions, feel free to type it in the chat. Or if you want to say it out loud yourself, you could write a star or write that you have a question, and then you can say it yourself. Can you see the first question from Tito? Larry?
Let me see if I can start my chat. Okay, stop share. Yeah, let me just open the chat. Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, right. First question, elaborate a bit more about the climatology view insulated from socio-environmental relationships and how things like shared socioeconomic pathways and social tipping dynamics for stabilizing Earth's climates would be placed inside the carbon policies. I think the problem is that it's difficult to place anything that is really analytical about the roots of climate change within carbon policies. Part of this is due to the fact that within, for example, the UN climate apparatus, if you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's divided into these different panels or different committees. One panel is only talking about basically carbon dioxide molecules, and another panel is talking about, society, this sort of abstraction, unexamined, unanalyzed, idea of society. And they're the one that is that panel or that committee that's likely to talk about these things like shared socioeconomic pathways that Tito mentioned, or social tipping dynamics for stabilizing Earth's climate. If you look at those pathways, if you look at those dynamics and the way they're analyzed by, for example, the UN, you don't find any mention of oil companies. You don't find any mention of the capitalist mode of production. You don't find any mention of trade. The dynamics of trade under capitalism. What they're looking for is a society that can be adjusted and adapted to climate change, or a society that can reverse climate change, but that society is completely unexamined in terms of its actual productive dynamics, in terms of its trade dynamics, and so forth. What they're looking for is tricks or technical fixes so that the unexamined assumptions about society, namely that it's a capitalistic society, can continue. So there's it's not only that you can't you can't analyze the causes of all of this excess carbon with this picture in terms of carbon molecules, because you can't get out the root cause of the carbon molecules, but it's also that you can't examine anything about really existing society using this framework, because it puts to one side the whole idea of, for example, the existing resistance to capitalist types of productions, to the takeover of land, to the creation of labor from which surplus can be extracted and so forth. That's inconceivable. You can't talk about that when you talk about shared socioeconomic pathways. You can't talk about that when you talk about social tipping dynamics. It's censored, it's forbidden. This doesn't come into it. So that's a limitation. That's a limitation that you could say is imposed by the fantasies inside climate science and climate policies. And I think it's a limitation that many movements are trying to transcend. But it's actually quite difficult. And I think this is also a cultural problem. I mean, roughly speaking, a lot of movements in the global South, especially popular movements, have no trouble understanding that mainstream climate science is based on fantasy, or that mainstream climate policy is based on these fantasies. But we Europeans and a lot of people in the global North have a lot more trouble seeing that, I think. So there's I think, a cultural gap there to be overcome.
And then I realized, because we're recording, it's maybe good that I read the questions out loud, so that people who watch it later can also see what it is. So there's a question from Birgitte here, which is, how do we start or support the climate debate based on a broader societal understanding?
I think the first thing to say in response to that is simply to start listening better. For example, several times I've been in conversations in the global South with ordinary rural villagers who are experiencing climate change firsthand, and how they look at it, and what they see the threat is, what they see the nature of the problem is, what they see the future is. And often I'm in the presence of, in the same meetings, in the same groupings, there will be either members of the intelligentsia from those same countries, or visiting Europeans like me, and they will more or less dismiss what the local people are saying and what the local people are analyzing in their understanding of climate change. And this is not the way, I think, to make progress in building movements. First thing you have to do is listen. Listen to what people are saying about mainstream climate science and mainstream climate policy. Listen to what the people who are fighting against the carbon offsets encouraged by the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, or the European Union emissions trading scheme. Listen to the people who are losing their land and their livelihoods and their ecological practices as a result of those schemes. And I think that's the starting point for supporting a broader climate debate that can get under the skin of some of these fantasies. I think there's an earlier question from Jimmy Jones there, maybe.
Yeah, there is. Sorry, Jimmy. So, whether right or wrong, for better or worse, how do you suggest imposing the political opinions you voice towards capital and labor in bodies such as the UN, UNFCCC, etc.? Surely making these entities too politically motivated will lead to further alienation from US and Brazil, etc.
Yeah, it's another very good question, and I think a question that we've all had a lot of trouble with. I think a lot of movements have come to the conclusion that, yeah, it's very useful to understand what's going on inside the UN and UNFCCC and so forth. But that there are certain limitations to what can be achieved within those forums, and that it might be more strategic to concentrate on movement building outside those forums, building the power of popular climate movements that, for example, don't accept this reduction of climate to carbon and want to look at the the underlying causes in a more analytic way. So the assumption that, our task is to, or our task might be to make these entities more politically motivated, or they are politically motivated already, of course, but to make them, to motivate their analysis in a different direction. The assumption that this is our task is to introduce more rigorous analysis into the UN, less fantasy, I think needs to be questioned. Maybe that isn't our priority. Maybe it would be a waste of time, to put it bluntly, to try to push these particular forms and these particular policies in a better direction, and perhaps our energies might be better spent outside these forums. But I mean, it's a difficult question. Where do you draw the line? When how do you, to what extent do you want to try to change the direction of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and so forth? I think that's an ongoing discussion.
Then there's one from Christian. Do you think that an increased level of threat or direct harm from climate change against the world's wealthiest countries is a necessary evil in order to achieve more actions and cooperation? And in other words, is the short-term level of threat from climate change simply too low or too invisible to enforce action?
Yeah, I wish I could give a positive answer to that question. I wish I could say that, well, maybe next year when there's more hurricanes or agriculture fails on a broader scale, maybe somehow, the states and the world's policymakers will wake up, and there will be more action and cooperation. By the way, I don't think the lack of action and cooperation is the problem. I mean, I think the deeper problem is the fantasies that I've been mentioning in this talk. But I would like to think that if things did get worse, the states and capital would respond in a positive way. But I think this is maybe to misunderstand the nature of capital in particular. I mean, as Marx pointed out so well, I mean, people behave differently as capitalists than they do as normal human beings. I don't doubt that any of the world's CEOs or any of the world's most any of the world's prime ministers as human beings would be really disturbed by the fact that their grandchildren might not have a future. They might be really disturbed next year if there's 10 times more hurricanes, or if agriculture fails. I'm confident that they would be very disturbed as human beings, but they would be powerless to act on their own understanding as human beings, insofar as they are also capitalists or defenders of capital. They don't have any choice within that system, but to continue to try to compete with other capitalists to accumulate more capital. So, and this is, I think, is becoming quite clear in the response to the COVID virus as well, is that for them as capitalists rather than as normal human beings, nothing matters except continuing to be able to accumulate capital in a competitive way over the next year or the next 10 years. And what happens ultimately to the planet is just not a part of that. So suicide is not a problem for capitalists as capitalists. And you can see this with the COVID virus. I mean, capital in many parts of capital are very desperate to get people back to work. Why? Because that's the only way they can continue to accumulate surplus, is by stealing the time and stealing the energies of workers. part of the energies of workers to accumulate capital and to outcompete their competitors. And in that logic, the actual effects of the COVID virus on their own families is irrelevant. You can see this in interviews with some of the people on that U.S. channel Fox News, where you find state officials or capitalists getting up in front of the cameras and they say, well, I'm a grandparent too. I'm concerned about my grandchildren too, but I think we should go out there and get back to work. And I'm willing to risk my life in order to that we can keep the malls open and people can continue to shop. And why aren't you? I mean, I'm willing to be a hero and to keep our trade system going. That's a very concrete example of how increased levels of direct harm, what we normal human beings would call direct harm, that has no effect on the particular structure of the way capital works.
I also have a question, and maybe it's actually two, because you were talking quite a bit about the role of fantasies, mainly in creating policies that are not good for people or the environment. And then you also talked about the COVID-19, and it sounded like you were pretty sure that what governments want to do afterwards is basically to try to increase consumption and economic activity to increase GDP and jobs. And I was wondering if now that society is kind of on hold and people can get like a little taste of how life without consumption is there any way we could use fantasy in a more positive way to create visions or actually create a different society that is not based on consumption and accumulation?
Well, I think again, a very good question. I think to try to struggle to respond to that question, I think we have to go back to the point I tried to make in the talk that, when we talk about fantasies, we're not talking about something that's in the mind. We're talking about something that is in reality. The fantasies are real. They're made of steel and concrete and so forth. They actually structure reality. And I think one positive thing that's happening during the COVID crisis is I think Bruno Latour in France remarked, is that suddenly we see that, we actually can stop the machine. When the COVID virus arrived, I mean, states discovered they did have the power to say, okay, well, people are going to have to stay at home for a while, and we're going to have to shut down the process of surplus accumulation, or at least reduce it for a while. And it happened. It actually happened. And this of course was an effect in reality, but more importantly, it was an effect on our imaginations. It opened up the possibility, which probably a year ago people would have said, "Oh no, this is unrealistic. It's not possible. This can never happen. No. We cannot have so many people actually not working in the United States or in Europe." But now suddenly it's a reality. So it becomes, what was impossible suddenly becomes every day. And this is, I think, very helpful in actually, creating a different kind of imagination. Yeah, that's one part. I mean, that would be one part of my response. I mean, another part of the response has to do with what Lacan and Zizek call traversing the fantasies. How do we deal with these fantasies if we can't deal with them in rational terms? And they had this idea called traversing a fantasy, which I don't quite understand, but I understand the first step of that, which is to acknowledge that these fantasies do determine our desires. They do determine the structure of reality. They do determine the structure of our desires, and to understand their power, to understand that they're active not only in sort of these weird fetishes that people talk about, but they're active inside physics. They're active inside climatology and so forth. And I think that's just acknowledging the sort of the existence and the presence of these fantasies, I think, is a first step in sort of getting beyond some of the damaging effects of these fantasies.
Thank you. And then I wonder, Jimmy, do you want to read your question out loud? Because it's kind of long. No, and then I'll do it. Or wait. Oh, his microphone doesn't work. Okay, then I'll try. I would like to suggest a different position than the one I think you take. Due to the complexity of the global social economic system and its relation to carbon, perhaps more focus on carbon is necessary with a greater fetishization towards CO2. What matters in the, what is ppm? ppm?
Parts per million. Parts per million.
Ah, parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, not the political system found beneath it. Or is it your opinion that without changing the system fundamentally, you don't have any chance of reducing carbon?
Yeah, I think we need to question that one sentence in the middle of your question, which is what matters is the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, not the political system found beneath it. I think that sentence is an example of the thing that I wanted to question in this talk, the idea that it's CO2 that has this special magic power, you know, that everything else is irrelevant. What the problem is, you know, the immigrant, the CO2, the Jew, the outsider who's coming in. And if we just, you know, sort of dealt with this figure, this imaginary figure, this specially potent figure of CO2 in the right way, we wouldn't need to think about anything else. But I think we do have to think about other things. I mean, you know, the Nazis never had any hope of dealing with the class conflicts within Germany, with the gender conflicts within Germany, with any other conflicts within Germany, by exterminating the Jews. That, you know, even in the Nazis' own terms, that was never going to work. The struggles would still be there, and they would continue. And I think you know, this may sound startling and extreme, but I think we do have to think about CO2 in the same way. CO2 does not have these magic powers. It's not the case that, you know, if we can have some special way of managing the CO2 molecules without thinking about anything else. And so we should concentrate on the special ways of managing these magic powers and not bother with anything else. I think that just won't work even in its own terms. And we've seen that in the obsessive concentration on CO2 over the last 25 years in the climate policies of the Kyoto Protocol, the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme, and the Paris Agreement. These things don't work even in their own terms, yet no one could criticize them for, you know, not concentrating on CO2. They concentrate on CO2 obsessively, and they don't pay any attention to the political system underneath it, or rather they pay a lot of attention to it, but they pay a lot of attention to trying to erase the significance of the political system that's underneath it, including the system which says that we need to increase the productivity of labor and we need to discipline labor by machines which are powered by fossil fuels. The climate problem is all about labor. It's all about work. It's all about keeping people at work so that they can make profits for capital. And if, you know, as people like Andreas Malm in your neighboring country of Sweden have emphasized, you know, you can't talk about climate without talking about machines. You can't talk about machines without talking about labor, and you can't talk about labor without talking about the political system of capitalism. So in conclusion, I would agree with the way you put it in your the last sentence of the question, is that without changing the system fundamentally, and I'm talking about the system machines disciplining and increasing the productivity of labor as the focus. Without changing the system fundamentally, you actually don't have any chance of even talking about your subject of CO2 in a constructive way.
Thank you. Now it's actually exactly 5 or 5:01. So unless somebody has a last question, I think we'll end it here. Thank you so much, Larry, for sharing all your knowledge and your analysis. We will post the recording of this webinar on YouTube and we will link to it from our Facebook page. And Larry has also put the presentation online. If there were something that you thought were interesting but you didn't have time to write it down, so we can also link to that so that you will have access to that. And yeah, our next webinar is already on Tuesday, so hope to see a lot of you there. And have a nice Sunday, everyone.
Okay, you too. It's a pleasure.